Hello, welcome to another setup panel for Afghanistan. Well, a lot is going on right now, and there's a potential, not potential actually, an actual escalation on the ground. And the ambiguity in terms of future projections are in the minds of not only Afghans, but many publics, many individuals. So today we will discuss exactly what's going on, but with a difference, a comprehensive thinking. It will not be only in a security-oriented thinking, but we will also take, for instance, social structure, also the thinking of the Afghan public, what do they demand, and later then we will conclude taking the will of the Afghan people. For this panel, we will have distinguished guests. The first one is Mr. Tamim Asey. His Excellency Tamim Asey is the former Vice Minister of Defense, founder and CEO of the Institute of War and Peace Studies in Afghanistan. Sir, welcome. You honored us.
Thank you.
The second one is from Pakistan, Mrs. Amina Khan. She is the director of Institute of Strategic Studies of Islamabad in Pakistan. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
You have been in differing, occasions like panels and conferences. Thank you for hosting me. And now I owe to you, and you are here. Thank you.
Sorry, just a slight correction. I'm the director of the Center for Afghanistan, Middle East and Africa at the Institute. I'm not the director of the Institute.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. And later then, we have Zalmay Nishat, Mr. Zalmay Nishat. He is the researcher at the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies, mainly focusing on issues on Afghanistan worldwide. Welcome, Mr. Nishat.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And
thanks for having me.
At the end, we have another visitor, another guest speaker, Mrs. Tanya Gutsuzyan. She's a journalist mainly focusing on Afghanistan, has a deep history in terms of her engagement in Afghanistan. She is a TV producer and also a member of Theatre World based in Istanbul. And welcome.
Thank you.
As I have introduced, Afghanistan has suffered a lot from the wars, conflicts, and needs peace and prosperity for a bright future for the new generations of Afghans. I had been in Afghanistan twice for two different assignments as a member of Turkish Army. The first thing that I had recognized in 2002 was that the life duration of a regular Afghan on the street was 42 years old. That means the half of a regular world citizen. So I questioned why. There were many reasons: health conditions, wars, conflicts, and also, I don't know, but it was really disturbing to see the living conditions, mainly in the camps, refugee camps, IDP camps. And today it increased gradually. On the other hand, now there's another danger to see Afghans suffering from the bad living conditions just because of a potential civil war or conflict on the ground. On the other hand, Afghanistan, for some, is a country situated at the heart of Asia, dividing the areas of influences of differing civilizations, differing powers. It was named as great power politics at the 18th and 17th century. And today, Afghanistan, extending from China towards Iran, plays the same role. On the other hand, Afghan politics is blended with many dynamics, not only about dominating the culture, dominating the country, but many different dynamics, ethnical, tribal, and etc. So I would like to ask first Mr. Tamim Asey, Your Excellency, how can you describe the security situation, taking the latest incidents on the ground? Because we know that Taliban claims victory right after the withdrawal of the United States. On the other hand, there are tense operations of the Afghan nation security forces and not circulated that much in media, but there are bright success. So how do you see it? What is the current situation, and what are your projections regarding short-term, mid-term, and long-term ones? Thank you. And the floor is yours, sir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Dr. Aslan. It's a pleasure always to be a part of CETA events. It's my second or third time being in CETA events. So let me thank you for this opportunity, and let me thank CETA, colleagues at CETA, for convening this very important and timely discussion, and to be a part of such distinguished panel with very experienced panelists. The situation, as if I could describe it in one word, is fragile, and it can go either way. There are three prevailing views about how could the situation in Afghanistan militarily unfold. The first one is that the Taliban blitzkrieg was predicted because of the vacuum that emerged as a result of US NATO forces' withdrawal from Afghanistan, and because of the enablers they provided, the Afghan forces, which is not there anymore. And therefore, there was an expectation that Taliban would capture any number between 10 to 17 provinces, and then we'll reach a new military stalemate. So the first view was that if though that vacuum is not filled, then there is this narrative of Taliban inevitability, that they will capture provinces after provinces, and it will have a snowball effect. The second view is, of course, that the withdrawal of US and foreign forces and the bravery of Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, specifically our commandos, Air Force, and Special Operation Forces, the triples as it is called, they will get a shock, but then they will reset the power and military balance, and we will go to a new military stalemate. We are yet to see a counteroffensive strategy as well as a military strategy in place by President Ghani's administration and his national security team to shape that new military stalemate using these offensive capabilities that they have. The third scenario, or the third view that exists, is that the Taliban have basically parked the peace process in Doha, and because they have been capturing provincial capital after provincial capitals, they feel that military victory is within reach. And what would happen is that this false narrative and fiction of a military victory would essentially plunge Afghanistan into a bloody civil war, the likes of Syria, Libya, and Iraq. And therefore, there is a possibility that you see in Iraq 2.0 emerging in Afghanistan, where the enemy are at the gates, type of on the doors of Baghdad, here in this case in Kabul, and then a national resistance forms, and they will tackle the Daesh or the Taliban in this case. But it will be a prolonged, bloody civil war. I think one thing which is very clear from the outset, that the Afghan war has no military solution. Military tactics and strategy could be the enablers and provide the environment for a meaningful political settlement, but it's not the solution to the Afghan war. And I hope the Taliban and their supporters that a military victory is a fiction, is a myth, because in worst case scenario, as I said, it will plunge Afghanistan into a Syrian-style civil war, or in the best case scenario, they will divide Afghanistan where they will have 17 or 18 provinces, and then the government will have 20 or 18 provinces under their control, essentially contested territories. Now, why are we here? We are here because of a combination of miscalculation of the Afghan government's national security team, but also because of the Americans' rush for withdrawal and domestic politics. It could have been averted if we had the right people within President Ghani's national security team in place, where they could have used the resources which are available from a military aspect, or from an intelligence perspective, or from other perspectives, and planned for a worst case scenario, and would have tackled this day. But that didn't happen. Or our international partners would have seen that the Taliban used the peace process as a tactic, not as a strategy to end violence. Essentially, the peace process in Afghanistan has been an augmenting tactic to the Taliban's military campaign, which many of us have argued that that is the case. Now, how can we essentially reverse this? The number one problem right now we have is a lack of a counteroffensive and military strategy in place to augment the peace process, to enable it. And I think what President Ghani is doing right now, going and talking to various political leaders, is to form that counteroffensive. Second thing that we require is a national mobilization. I believe that the withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan provides an opportunity for us to mobilize people and truly decentralize this war, whereas the Taliban truly understand that this war is not only the government, a fight for survival, but it's also for a new way of life for many Afghans. And it will be the people who will rise up against them. And we see the uprisings all around the country against the Taliban. In Herat, you see, Ismail Khan. In North, you see Atta Mohammad Noor and others. All over Afghanistan. In Kandahar, you saw tribal leaders going there. The second thing is we really need to work on what I call tackling the 3D effect, which is the demoralization, defection, desertion, and dwindling resources. The Afghan forces have been fighting an American way of fighting or warfare in an Afghan context. We really need to indigenize and Afghanize this war. And for that, you need people who really understand this country and this culture, and you need a national security military team, as well as a national security and national military strategy in place to really indigenize this war. That's why the Afghan forces are so addicted to air support and to other source of enablers, which American forces have been, because the Americans basically trained Afghans in their own way, and in an environment and a geography like Afghanistan, many times that is not a feasible way to go ahead. So therefore, when they don't get those enablers, you come to face challenges like demoralization and defections, desertions. Now, these defections and desertions are, if you really calculate it, is at 11% of the total force. Some people argue it is 7%, which is negligible at this point, but it could have a snowball effect, and we need to tackle that very soon. Now, I think what President Ghani needs to do, and others immediately, is to form that military strategy, counteroffensive plan in place, and mobilize forces, local forces, with the centrality of the Afghan forces, where the ANDSF will be at the center, and then its capabilities will be augmented by local forces to deliver a new military stalemate, an Afghan military stalemate, whereas the Taliban will realize that the military victory is not within reach, and then they would be serious about reaching a political stalemate. And that is a high possibility And it's something within reach, but it requires leadership, vision, a team and management, and people who are connected to the roots of this country and people who really know this country. I have other things to say about Taliban's military strategy and campaign, but I'll leave it for now. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, sir. As I see from your statements, I think a new balance in terms of military is required to push Taliban agree with a political solution. So this is a security-oriented thinking, though the reality of Afghanistan. And I think you sounded a very interesting but a really important conceptualization, let me say. Afghanizing the conflict, it's really important because conventionality usually does not respond to requirements, prerequisites of newly emerging conflict types. On the other hand, our desire, our wishful thinking is based on political solution, not to have Afghan people be harmed from a new stalemate. On the other hand, I see that there is a danger of establishing a new balance in Afghanistan, either through regional defense existences like Herat, like the others at the north, but it's much more risky for the future integrity of Afghanistan. That's what I see. So let's wait and see exactly what type of response Ghani government will push to the ground. Thank you so much for this valuable insight. So let me go to Mrs. Aminahan, because, well, Afghanistan, even though landlocked, even though at the edge of Hindu Kush Mountains, is not isolated from the globe. It's a country that most states now have an eye on it, both at the north, east, west, or at the south. So as a Pakistani eye, how do you see it? I mean, what about the regional and global dynamics? Because I see that there's an ongoing global struggle right now after the withdrawal, because the American withdrawal means they are losing ground in the Central Asia at the expense of strategic balance towards Russia and China. And in the meantime, there are regional dynamics because offshoots of the regional countries are inside Afghanistan. So how do you see, how can you evaluate this regional and global dynamics, taking specifically Afghanistan to the epicenter?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Aslan, for having me. And I think you've given me a very difficult question to answer, but I will try to give you a perspective, which is obviously my personal perspective. Now, as Mr. Assi already, pointed out that, the war in Afghanistan, which we are seeing, having been spanned for more than 2 decades, clearly does appear to be coming to a rather inconclusive end, with the political, the security, and the economic transition process completely in a limbo. And unfortunately, with limited gains, Afghanistan is certainly far from being stable, as it does continue to be challenged by innumerable problems. After all, Afghanistan is not what it used to be. There are now new and multiple actors that have taken center stage with new realities. And let us not forget the strategic rivalries that have increased in Afghanistan. Therefore, Afghanistan will continue to present challenges to the international community, and more so the region, and particularly neighboring states. Now, although more than a year has passed since the signing of the US-Taliban agreement, very little has been achieved in terms of reaching a negotiated settlement, and I think we can see this on the ground with the Taliban, gaining territory. Now, while many have been very critical of the agreement because it has, overlooked essential elements necessary for peace, such as, securing a ceasefire, attaining a workable compromise between Kabul and the Taliban, not to forget, the future political setup acceptable to all. Despite these shortcomings, I think that the agreement should be acknowledged and appreciated for happening at all, considering, the bloodshed that the country has been witnessing. And I still think that it is the best chance for peace that the country perhaps might ever get. Hence, there is still time to salvage the situation despite the ongoing situation in Afghanistan. And I think it is essential in that regard to ensure that all aspects of the agreement are fulfilled by the principal stakeholders. And let me just address them briefly one by one. Now, let's come over to the Taliban. Now, look, one factor that has consistently cast a shadow over the talks has been the increasing level of violence on the Taliban's part. Now, the Taliban, I have to say, have been very contradictory when it comes to this. On the one hand, they support the notion of a peaceful solution to the conflict. They say that they oppose a military takeover, but clearly we do not see this happening on the ground. And certainly the level of violence is not reducing on their part. Now, interestingly, while the Taliban have halted attacks against American forces or international forces, what little are left, their reluctance to abandon or rather even reduce violence against Afghan national security forces is a major stumbling block. And again here, I think it is unjustifiable for them to do so, because they used to justify their insurgency as a means of liberating Afghanistan from foreign control. But at the end of the day, it is not foreigners that the Taliban are fighting with. In fact, ordinary civilians, and for that matter, ordinary Afghans that make up the Afghan national security forces are losing their lives. Therefore, the group needs to show their commitment by ending violence. There can be no other way. And the group should do this not as a sign of weakness or submission, but rather to demonstrate their commitment towards a peaceful solution they keep on talking about. And in all honesty, if the Taliban can accept the US, the same country that overthrew them and so invaded Afghanistan, they should be able to engage and accept the Afghan government as an equal stakeholder. Therefore, in my mind, there is no doubt that the onus of reducing violence lies with the Taliban. Moreover, the Taliban keep on speaking of an inclusive political setup, that they don't envisage a monopoly of power. But again, their stance towards, a future political setup, again, in my eyes, is shrouded in ambiguity, to say the least. They have yet to present a concrete framework. Therefore, on the Taliban's part, they need to move beyond the rhetoric, and they need to be open to some sort of a power-sharing arrangement that is acceptable to all Afghans, and that does include the government in Kabul. That is the only way that they can secure for themselves, a place in the future political arena. And this is, the only way and the best chance the group has for securing for themselves a place in Afghanistan. Otherwise, it's going to be contestable. Now, let's talk about Kabul. Now, it is important to highlight, we often talk about the external challenges to the peace process, but very little focus is given to the internal or the national challenges, which in my opinion, I think are the greatest hurdles in the way of peace. Now, differences and divisions within Afghanistan, within the Afghan government, and we've seen this, between President Ghani and Abdullah, as well as different political factions, have played a major role in stalling talks. Therefore, I think it is important for Kabul to focus on political and national reconciliation, as well as national and social healing. They are very critical factors that have largely been missing from the Afghan, equation. Again, I say here that external actors can only do so much. It is important for Kabul to take ownership of the situation and realize that, at the end of the day, talking to the Taliban and reaching a compromise, good or bad, does lie in the hands of the Afghans. And it is obviously a very tall order, something that is not going to be easy, but this is something that the Afghans will have to do for themselves. Now, coming over to the US, I think the US also has to be very clear on its position. With the ongoing US, exit, it appears, or Afghanistan is being portrayed as a regional issue for now. But I think we're all very aware that, Afghanistan has the seeds of a global issue. And again, I say here, I reiterate that there is still time to salvage the situation. Now, the fact remains, despite the blame game and whatnot, that the US was in fact the main party that legitimized the Taliban by signing the Doha Agreement, and that too in the absence of Kabul. Now, they began furthermore to execute the agreement by declaring their withdrawal without fulfilling critical aspects of the agreement, which are so necessary for peace. And that is, number one, attaining a ceasefire or securing a ceasefire from the Taliban. Again, there was no headway in intra-Afghan talks, let alone a political settlement. And also, little or no talk about the kind of future political setup Afghanistan will have, whether it will be inclusive or interim or whatnot. Hence, I think it is very important for the US, instead of shifting the onus or the responsibility for the future of Afghanistan onto others, particularly in the region, which I'll touch upon, it is important for the US, again, I reiterate, with a major stakeholder and a key signatory of the agreement, to push for a credible and workable solution. And this can only happen when you implement the key principles of the Doha Agreement, and again, by putting pressure on both parties, that is the Taliban and Kabul, to deliver. The US has a responsibility to fulfill, and again, this entails a responsible and a measured exit, as well as leaving behind some semblance of stability before it exits. Because, more so, the region is going to face the repercussions, and we've already seen that. Now, unless and until a workable power sharing framework is not brokered, between Kabul and the Taliban, neither side is going to give in. Therefore, again, reiterate and repeat that the US must leave with some semblance of stability, and this could even entail, prolonging their exit if need be. Now, as I mentioned, time and again, if you look at policy circles within the US, the situation in Afghanistan is being, pushed over to, the region. Now, it is interesting because I think despite their previous differences and divergences, it appears that for the first time, there is this strange regional strategic coincidence, if I may call it, amongst Afghanistan's immediate neighbors, which is, of course, Pakistan, Iran, Russia, China, the Central Asians, and Turkey, which entails regional ownership, recognition of a negotiated settlement between the principal stakeholders, that is the Taliban and Kabul, as well as the role of the Taliban, but more importantly, not pushing for a military takeover. All these countries have been categorical in this aspect, that they do not favor a military takeover of the group. And this, of course, also entails curbing transnational terrorism and groups such as the ISKP, which is a threat to the region. Now, while the notion of a regional consensus does exist and may certainly be a ray of hope for Afghanistan, there are important questions. To what extent are regional countries willing to, come in? While yes, they'll continue to provide political, economic, and developmental support, I think at this particular stage, it is very unlikely that these states are going to extend military or security support. Because if that was the case, I think they should have been engaged, way before. Nobody is willing to replace the US, that is for sure. In fact, let me be very honest, every country, particularly when we look at the refugee situation, is out to fend for itself, particularly to secure itself from the possible consequences that will come out of Afghanistan. Now, we have seen valid interlocutors in the region. We've seen Pakistan, China, Russia, Iran, Uzbekistan, and Turkey that have been trying to facilitate talks. Now, I personally feel that there is regional consensus, and there is certainly an appetite within the region to play a bigger role. Therefore, there should be greater push for maybe a regional framework or monetary mechanism that could push both sides to deliver. Now, here, let me just mention that considering Pakistan's historical baggage with Afghanistan, I think Pakistan would not be best suited to play this role, but we could have China, or for that matter, even Turkey, come in and play that role of a regional interlocutor. However, again, it boils down to one thing. At the end of the day, regional countries can only do so much. As hard as it appears, both Kabul and the Taliban need to learn to accept and accommodate each other. They need to compromise, because there is no other way. Again, the biggest hurdle now is not external spoilers or elements, but in fact internal. And while there certainly can be regional collective pressure, or for that matter, even the possibility of a regional monitoring mechanism to make all sides deliver, the onus, unfortunately, is on the Afghans. So I'll end here, and maybe we can continue this in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. I totally agree, because little has been achieved for 20 years. That's a fact. Because peace and reconciliation is not something that you can suddenly have it, but there must be a background in terms of communicating with the official and unofficial ones, with the public, and also the states providing support to Afghanistan should facilitate such kind of compromise. That's the issue. On the other hand, there's something I'm really concerned about the regional dynamics. When you try to do something, you usually legitimize, as you have criticized the United States in your speech, legitimize another party. So legitimizing is a dangerous issue. Once you legitimize, you can't step back. So I think in the coming days, the nature of such legitimization will be a point of discussion or point of debate, because if you take the word phrasing power sharing in Afghanistan and legitimization, that means, well, 20 years is really much for a power sharing through a legitimization. So the least agreeable terms must be in the minds of the Afghan decision makers and Afghan public. But for me, the ultimate decision maker should be the Afghan public. So I want to go to Mr. Nishat, Zalmay Nishat, because what I wonder is the attitude of Afghan public. If you go through a differing provinces in Afghanistan and have a chat with a regular citizen on the street, I think you will hear the voice of people, not the power brokers. So the ultimate issue is to address this demand, because at the end, as Mr. Asay claimed, there exists an Afghanized type of civil war in Afghanistan. This unheard voice will be a point of reference in the minds. So how do you see the attitude of Afghan public? What do they demand? That's for peace and reconciliation. That's the issue. But what is the points that should be raised on behalf of Afghan public?
Thank you very much, Dr. Aslan, for the opportunity and for CETA. And it's an honor and pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel. This is a very difficult question to speak on behalf of the people of Afghanistan, but I'll try my best to give a historical understanding that I have myself, my personal view on the problems. Minister Arsi really kind of, gave very nicely the three scenarios, the possible scenarios. And we are unfortunately in the middle of perhaps at this point, it's difficult to say, but it seems the worst case scenario. And we have a huge humanitarian crisis. Figures show that about 1 million people have been displaced. I was watching videos, footage from last night in a car park in Kabul that my friend had shot, and there was huge number of displaced people who basically were in need of food and shelter. There's none of them, and the community is trying to do its best. But let's go back to the what went wrong from my perspective and where we are. Afghanistan as a country, as a modern nation state, started its roots from starting as a buffer zone between the Tsarist Russia and British Empire in India, and through enabling basically Abdurrahman Khan, from 1882 to 1901, a centralized state was created. And Abdurrahman Khan was funded by the British, not only was giving money, but also given weapon to create this highly centralized state in Kabul, which is basically, and then this tradition was continued by his son Habibullah Khan, and then Amanullah, his grandson, in the 1920s. And then we know the rest of the history, what happened. But then we are ended up with this in a country which is mosaic, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and highly diverse and plural, with a very, very centralized structure, perhaps in the world. And then we ended up through the legal processes of the first constitution of 1923, and then those who framed the constitution had an integrationist, basically idea, the assimilationist idea, and they took mostly the model from the Turkish nationalism model, but in a very diverse and a very different setting. And it culminated to 1964 constitution, and then then in the late 1970s, we know that the turbulences because of the invasion of the Soviet Union and the dislocation of the system. Unfortunately, I mean, during this period of time, different ethnic communities started to stand against the. I mean, that I will come to the Constitution of 2004, but then I need to explain what by this dislocation I mean. So different ethnic communities and religious communities, the Shias, the Sunnis, the ethnic groups during the invasion of the Russian started establishing strong links with the regional countries and with the international powers, and they put their hands on resources, on wealth, and on basically they became more aware of the condition that they were living under this highly centralized government. I mean, and at times very oppressive. Then basically this dislocation and this rupture should have been a point that the politicians after 2001 invasion of the Americans, the intervention of the international community, they should have taken that into consideration. But the 2004 Constitution of Afghanistan basically was a copy of the 1964 Constitution with one major change. Instead of king, we had a president. And at that time, the executive was the prime minister, but all the powers of the king and the prime minister was given to this president. After 2004, this highly centralized political and administrative system was unable to accommodate all these demands and all these basically relations that has been established with the region and with the world. And then the problem of representation has become an issue. And I want to come to that. I mean, in our discussions of the peace, we are talking about two sides, the Taliban and the government in Kabul. But the problem is that Afghanistan is too diverse to be represented by either the Taliban or the current government. I mean, surveys have shown for the past several years, the Taliban have about 13% of sympathizers or supporters in Afghanistan. 13%, 13. And the reason why they're so powerful is because they have, you know, support of our neighboring country, and since their establishment in the 1990s, they have been enjoying safe havens. Their leaders' headquarters is in Pakistan, and this challenge was unfortunately never managed to be addressed during the American and NATO presence in Afghanistan in the past 20 years. So 13% of the people of Afghanistan. And then you have a government which has been, is in power, and we know about these election disputes of 2009, 2014, and 2019. And then we know that mismanagement, and we know that at the moment, the uprising, popular uprising, and the resistance to that is underway, that the people want to stand against the Taliban. But this government, which has problems of, you know, it's managing its own armed forces, whether they want or do not want or cannot basically assist the people's uprising to stand against the Taliban. So the issue of what I'm trying to come back to is that any political settlement that we are looking at in the future has to take this element of representation into consideration. That 2001 Bonn conference tried to sort the issue of representation through an estimated ethnic groups, basically numbers, and so we know that how that didn't. The reason it didn't work was that we had this highly centralized power, which all the decisions were made by one office, the office of the president, and that's why we couldn't basically hold different and accommodate different demands and factions, political factions in Afghanistan together. And then also the concentration of power in Kabul and the periphery how to manage the periphery is another question that needs to be taken into consideration in any future political deal. And all these lessons that that we have learned from the past 20 years in terms of the political and administration structure of the country needs to be taken into consideration in any political settlement in the future. And the basically these are the kind of things that I wanted to reflect about the views of the people on the ground and the issue of the representation between the problem of representation between the government and the Taliban. And coming to the issue of humanitarian situation, I mean, the government is not, I mean, it is, as we know, is struggling to rebalance the armed forces and basically started its own offensive against the Taliban. But on the other hand, we have ended up with a situation that a million people at least, based on numbers, have basically escaped from the districts that have fallen under the Taliban, or now the cities, and they have come to the big cities. Either they have converged on in Kabul, Mazar-e-Sharif, or Kandahar, or maybe other big cities in the east, maybe Nangarhar. I don't know what, I mean, the government, I'm not sure the government would not have any much to help this humanitarian situation. And then we have ended up also a lot of people escaping from Afghanistan to regional countries like Pakistan and Iran. And we know that already we have millions of people, millions from Afghanistan living in both of these countries, and some of them are escaping towards Europe through using the Turkey route as a transit to Europe. But we know about the European kind of, policy of having a deal with the transit countries to not allow refugees entering in their country. So we are facing a huge humanitarian situation in Afghanistan on the ground that it's very painful for all of us, especially those of us who are from Afghanistan, like myself.
Thank you, dear friend. As I see, I think political settlement appears the first and the imminent issue that is in the minds of the public, and humanitarian escalation means survival has become the priority, because once they immigrate from their lands to the other cities as IDP or refugee to the other countries, well, all dynamics changes. We have experienced the Syrian influx to Turkey. 3.6 million Syrians are now living in Turkey, and Afghans will add more value in terms of numbering, and that's another, because once you immigrate to another country or to another region, the risk is losing identity. Not only about humanitarian escalation, the second, third generations are usually losing themselves in between cultures. So that's really a thing that Afghan decision makers and also Taliban should be in charge of, thinking. It's a concern, I think, for the next generation. This is what I believe. Thank you so much. So final question goes to Mrs. Tanya. She's an expert on Afghanistan. Well, I think you should touch collateral consequences of a probable war, civil war in Afghanistan. Because collateral means, well, you can directly target a certain segment, but the collateral one cannot be estimated. As a former military, when the US strikes were circulated in the news, I was trying to check how many civilians were counted as civilian casualty. As a, if you term this as a collateral effect, I think it's not fair. But collateral effects are in economy, are in production cycles, social structure. So how do you take it?
Well, Murad, thank you for having me on again today. In particular, among such an impressive group, they made some interesting points. They raised some interesting points. As you said, you asked me to discuss the collateral consequences of a potential for intra-Afghan conflict. Some might call it a civil war, others might call it a proxy war. Definitions may not really matter. Right now, we are seeing a foreign-backed insurgent group waging war against an elected government, however flawed that government may be. Whatever the case, there is no denying that a protracted conflict between the Taliban and government forces will impact the population in several ways and on an unprecedented scale, primarily humanitarian, political, societal, and economic. Now let's look at a few of those issues. First, the potential for high casualties in light of earlier conflicts in Afghanistan. Kabul's population in 2021 is estimated at over 4.3 million. That's nearly double what it was in 2001. During the Afghan civil war in the early 1990s, the population of Kabul was only around 1.6 million and dropped to 400,000 in 1994 when warring factions regularly targeted civilians for attacks. There is no precise record of casualties from that period. Clearly, many thousands were killed in factional fighting. Prisoners and civilians were executed by rivals. Tens of thousands died of starvation and disease. Hundreds of thousands were also killed or injured by landmines. We can only imagine what a return to fighting would cost in terms of death and destruction resulting from another protracted war right now. For those that survive, one can anticipate another exodus of refugees. In the late 80s, the number reached 6 million, and another round of fighting might see this again. This time, however, as you mentioned earlier, as one of our panelists mentioned, Afghan refugees are already being turned back from several countries, and those who have found refuge abroad are facing challenging circumstances, if not outright persecution. Second, let's consider the economy, agriculture and subsistence farming in particular. Agriculture has traditionally dominated Afghanistan's economy, some 25% of the country's GDP. About 70% of Afghans live and work in rural areas, mostly on farms, and 60% or so of all households derive some, if not most, of their income from agriculture. The sector still employs 40% of the total workforce, and more than half of Afghans living in rural areas contribute to agriculture in some way. But climate change and natural disasters have impacted this sector considerably, and many farming families rely on external aid and grants. In the event of a return to conflict, it is easy to foresee further setbacks by looking at the past. Conflict results in massive displacement. We already mentioned that, from agricultural areas, with the notable exception, of course, of the narcotics trade. According to one report released just 2 months ago, severe drought coupled with increased violence and attacks on civilians have forced many families in rural areas to flee for safety. This decrease in production results in higher prices for scarcer food, leading to dependence on external assistance to prevent disease and hunger. Without this external assistance provided, or even worse, prohibited, starvation and a humanitarian catastrophe, such as in Yemen, could follow. Other challenges exist. War could also see the further destruction of irrigation networks, villages, fields, livestock structures, and orchards. Landmines are a particular feature of Afghanistan, and more conflict could see a suspension of international programs with an effect on the agriculture sector. In the short term, landmines and other explosive remnants of war kill and maim people. In the long term, they seriously undermine the country's economy and food security. Third, narcotics trade. Another consequence of protracted conflict in Afghanistan would be a boom in opium cultivation. Today, in the midst of increasing violence and uncertainty, opium cultivation is overtaking traditional agriculture. Afghanistan is the world's largest supplier of opium, and for some Afghans, it's a crucial element of their livelihood. The critical narcotics trade would only add to the sectarian conflict. It promotes criminality, illegal cross-border trade, and funds further violence. One only has to look at the narco economies in South America and the consequent violence and refugee flows to see the instability that such trade encourages. Now, economic setbacks. Who wants to trade with a narco state? What does a narco state produce anyway? Sadly, Afghanistan is rich in minerals and natural resources, including extensive deposits of natural gas, petroleum, coal, marble, gold, copper, precious and semi-precious stones, and many rare earth elements. In 2006, US Geological Survey estimated that Afghanistan has as much as 36 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 3.6 billion barrels of oil. In 2010, US Pentagon officials, along with American geologists, revealed the discovery of nearly $1 trillion in untapped mineral deposits in Afghanistan. Another memo said that Afghanistan could become the Saudi Arabia of lithium, and some believe that untapped minerals are worth up to $3 trillion. Now, in the event of a protracted conflict, it would be impossible to regulate these sectors, and it would be fair to predict that these resources would be looted as a free-for-all, exploited by the warring parties to fund their operations. At best, China could come in and make a deal with the warring parties, but it is likely the only beneficiaries would be the warlords. In conclusion, the effect of intrastate conflict resembling that of the 90s could completely reverse the gains made in the last 20 years. Further, as the population is far larger, the impact would be among a greater number of people, creating significant hardship within the country and beyond the borders as a result of refugee flows. It would unleash narcotics production, which would not only fund and fuel far greater internal conflict, but would add to the supplies of illegal narcotics trade in the region, Southeast Asia and Europe. Most consequential would be the collateral damage to individuals, families, and society from such a war. And a Yemen-like scenario is not beyond the realm of possibility. Perhaps this assessment is overly grim, but even a fraction of this assessment, if true, would be a tragedy.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Really, I'm really impressed by the numbers of the collateral impacts because, well, immigration, refugees, death and destruction, economy, starvation, mines. Well, very correct. But I think we should remember one thing. Once a conflict erupts, it's really hard to step back from the collateral consequences. So the issue is to solve the problem in an appropriate time frame that you can prevent these deficiencies, probable deficiencies. Thank you so much. No, I want to now direct questions for a short remark to the guests. By that way, I can take your opinion because as far as I take notes, there are further questions either coming to my mind or I have received some through social media. But I would like to ask His Excellency Asay one significant question because he cut it short when approaching to the concluding remarks. It was Taliban's counter strategy, because if you take Afghan governments to produce a strategy to respond a not probable, but actual Taliban threat, I think the strategy of Taliban is still running though. What could be the further for that? So if you please, shortly touch this issue, I will be glad.
Well, thank you. Those of us who have worked in the national security establishment in Afghanistan, whether the National Security Council, Interior, or Defense, we always said that there are three critical issues that need to be challenged if we are going to ever defeat the Taliban. The first one is to question the sanctuaries and find a way to tackle this issue. And those sanctuaries are in Pakistan, and the different shuras of Taliban are named after Pakistani cities, the Quetta Shura, the Miranshah Shura, the Peshawar Shura. I mean, these are not Afghan cities. And it is very well established and well known to our international partners that they have strategic calculations when it comes to Pakistan because of its population, because of its nuclear capabilities, and because of many other factors, that they never intervened. Well, they intervened, but then it was that. But it's also because of the addiction that Pakistan has to jihadism and using extremism as an instrument of foreign policy on its neighbors, namely Afghanistan, India, others, including Iran. And we have to do something about it because it will not stop here. And that was one. Second, it was that you are sending a conventional force to fight an unconventional war. And that's a recipe for disaster. Guerrilla warfares, proxy warfares, conventional forces can never defeat them because it's a recipe for disaster, but it's also because of the old Chinese prescription of death by 1,000 cuts. And the geography of Afghanistan is as such that it's very, easy to hide and as well as wage a proxy insurgency inside the country with sanctuaries outside. And the third thing is, of course, that we try to, focus on is the global call that this particular ideology has. Let me remind you, many times when we engaged with the Pakistani interlocutors at Pakistani armed forces, including the army, very senior people, we are talking about 2-star above generals. Bottom line for them was that if we take on the Taliban inside our territory, we are bringing the Afghan war inside Pakistan. And essentially, we have a long group of, and long list of madrasas inside Pakistan. And they often cited the Lal Masjid inside Pakistan, inside Islamabad incident, that when Musharraf took over, and also the infamous deal that they struck with the TTP when almost the Pakistani Taliban was at the gates of Islamabad when they were there. So they were saying that we cannot tackle these folks and seize their operational environment inside Pakistan because then we'll transfer your war into our geography. And that was one of the major issues that oftentimes we came to. Now, the history shows in 1990s that this problem will not be limited to Afghanistan. If the Taliban secure a victory in Afghanistan, they will ask for Islamabad. They will start asking for Uzbekistan. They will start asking for Tajikistan. A military victory of the Taliban and extremists here would mean destabilization of the Fergana Valley, which is Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, all that ring and the belt. It means destabilization of Pakistan because extremist forces would start asking for a Sharia-based government in Pakistan. It would mean Kashmir going up in the flames. And it would mean, the entire region plunging into some sort of a proxy extremist war. Therefore, now, if you don't answer those three issues, some of them are Afghan issues. We accept that. It's Afghans that need to fix the conventional warfare and unconventional part of it. It's the Afghans who have to fix the governance part. It's the Afghans. But there are certain elements that the region, specifically Pakistan and Iran, has to do something about it. Because if they don't do it, we are only cleaning at the end of the tape the water that comes from the tap, not the tap itself. You don't turn off the tap, but the water, we just end up cleaning the water at the receiving end. And that will not be, fixing the problem. Now, in terms of the recent Taliban offensive, what has essentially happened with the recent Taliban offensive is it's not because they have the force and the capabilities. It's because of a new strategy that they, literally copied from the 1990s Soviet experience, whereas they concentrate forces and power on a particular set of provinces. And then they ask fighters to come from outside of Afghanistan as well as from other provinces. Recent intelligence estimates say that 15,000 foreign fighters have actually come to Afghanistan. We had an influx of 15,000 foreign fighters. And these are Central Asians, Pakistanis, Arabs, and others, who often we get their dead bodies on battlefields or their ID cards with them to witness what they call the final battle or the final victory against NATO and US. They concentrate those forces on a couple of provinces like a flood, and then they come in other provinces, but they really don't have, back end, and they have no governance plan. That is why, with the critical enablers of the Afghan forces gone, a lot of these posts and a lot of these bases cannot hold against such a strong flood of Afghan Taliban forces, as well as augmented by foreign terrorist fighters. It's also, the strategy that they have been following is that they act like a flood. They have started from the north, they went to the west, and then they went to the south, and now eventually when the weather gets very cold in the north and central Afghanistan, they will go to eastern Afghanistan. But everywhere that they have captured, they have no governance plan. And everywhere that they have captured, they have went and cleansed those areas of what they call, collaborators, government, sympathizers, so on and so forth. And then they left it. They have not even delivered rule of law. So it's all violence, a lot of atrocities and brutality, and oftentimes lots of killings and cleansing. Now, many of us see that the Taliban strength, the Afghan forces, they are also very overstretched. In many of the provinces that they have captured and in territories that they have captured, Taliban move from frontline to frontline. They don't stay to hold those areas and deliver governance, because for the Taliban, many of us ask, okay, you capture a territory, what is next? You have to start delivering services, governance, justice, so on and so forth. None of that has been there. Therefore, it's I believe that if the Afghan forces come with the right regional military diplomacy, with the right prescription and indigenization and decentralization of this war, and if they really deliver a new military stalemate, then the Taliban's gains will be rolled back, and we would have, kind of reset the military power balance locally. But you cannot do that as long as they get foreign fighters from outside to augment their strategy, their capabilities on the ground.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Well, the points that you have raised are really important in terms of providing a countrywide stability or not. Because if you review the strategy of Taliban, controlling one area and later then just flowing out for another one, but no adequate level of force beyond or a governance structure, I think this military stalemate may easily change after a comprehensive strategy of the Kabul government. That's what I understand from your speech. But I want to go to Aminahan, because I have received many messages through social media, and you have also raised some. What is Pakistan's strategy exactly for Afghanistan? But please be short, because we don't have time that much.
Well, I think it's very difficult to be short, since you're talking about Pakistan here. I am not going to indulge in the blame game. The fact of the matter is that Pakistan, like other regional countries, has a lot to answer for. The policies have been vague, they've been questionable in the past, and I think that is something that is recognized by the state. But let us look at the realities and the facts on the ground. The Taliban, again, I repeat, have recognition not just from the Americans, but also from the region, and they have learned the art of diplomacy. They're not dependent on one particular actor. There are a number of actors within the region that are openly engaging and supporting the group. If you look at the situation in Afghanistan, Mr. Asay should know this better than I do, that there's an open flow of arms, money, support, and whatnot, number one. Number two, what is the biggest hurdle to the peace process? It's not external. If it is external, it is limited. Suppose, and I agree, that there is an open, to and fro movement across the border. Bulk of the fighters are in Afghanistan. And the fact that the principal stakeholders, which is the Taliban and the Ashraf Ghani government, are not willing to engage and compromise on their maximalist positions. What has been happening in Doha? And while I understand, again, I keep on referring to the historical baggage that Pakistan has. Unfortunately, Pakistan is damned if it does and it's damned if it doesn't. In the beginning, when President Ghani came into power, please remember, I don't want to go into history, but Pakistan took a backseat and said that we will support the process, but at the end of the day, the process should be, achieved between the two principal stakeholders. That did not happen. And on the insistence of President Ghani, Pakistan has been engaging with the Taliban as it has been engaging with Kabul as well. Most recently, we were having a peace conference where we had called a number of political factions from Afghanistan. But again, that was scuttled at the last minute by, the situation in Afghanistan, particularly the Ghani regime. My only point is that I think time and again we talk about the repercussions. Which country has faced the bulk of the repercussions from Afghanistan? It's been Iran and it's been Pakistan. And while this might sound like a cliche, it is very difficult for us to convince our Afghan brothers and sisters. But believe me, the future of Afghanistan is very important for Pakistan. We have suffered a lot, and so have the Afghans. And I think the only way to move forward is to try and build on some sort of consensus and continuous engagement. Pakistan's stance, by the way, has been very clear from day one, that there is no military solution, and at the end of the day, you have to engage with the Taliban, whether we like it or we don't. And unfortunately, it's taken the international community more than 2 decades to realize this. Now, at the same time, please understand, I think, Mr. Tamim did point to this, and I will be open about this. Pakistan has its limitations. It is trying to push both sides to deliver, but at the end of the day, peace can only be achieved when both sides want it. And yes, Pakistan cannot take kinetic operations against the Taliban, because at the end of the day, if the war does come back to Pakistan, and we've seen our fair share of it, no international community member, or for that matter, even regional countries will come into, step in and help us out here. So I think there has to be realistic expectations from all countries. And that is why I think Pakistan does believe in this regional consensus. And again, I think China is a very credible partner. It has a great relationship with all the Afghan political factions, including the Taliban. So why not? Again, because we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't, we would want China to be that neutral player that could head this regional mechanism. But my only point is that whether you like it or not, Pakistan is a neighbor. We host more than 3 million refugees. So when we keep on hearing of these statements or these notions or slogans of sanction Pakistan, remember, those refugees will also suffer. This blame game is futile. It's counterproductive. We need to move beyond this. We need to think of a regional consensus and regional framework to move forward. And this does entail putting pressure on the Taliban. But let's be very honest. The day the Americans signed an agreement with the Taliban, excluding Kabul, for that was a military. While, you have your fair share of complaints from Pakistan, I think you need to, move back and go back and, revisit the agreement and ask the Americans, because they're leaving in a haphazard manner. They're leaving Afghanistan in a lurch, and conveniently, it's for the region to pick up the mess and protect itself from the consequences.
Okay, thank you. Now, let's have Mr. Nishat. The discussions may be based on many different parameters, dynamics though. I want to raise the issue of radicalization, because once Taliban has power in Afghanistan, well, what was the reason of the US intervention in 2001? To have Taliban be denied to provide support to Al-Qaeda. But still we have Al-Qaeda as a network. On the other hand, a probable Taliban government in Afghanistan will facilitate such kind of organizations be active. So how do you see it? And this scenario has the probability to diffuse the neighboring states. For instance, one vulnerable area at the most, that's what I believe, is China. Eastern Turkestan is really open for such kind of formations because they are looking for a light. That means Chinese are concerned and they have accepted Taliban in Beijing. So how do you see it?
Yeah, this is very, very important question, and I think already Minister Asi spoke about this very vividly and kind of pointed the worries that the people of Afghanistan have and the region must have about such an eventuality, that if we were to end up in Afghanistan with a government led by the Taliban, which I hope will not be the case, because we can see the uprising, but unfortunately the uprising, people's uprising and resistance is very disconnect from each other. You have Ismail Khan in Herat, you have Ustad Ata Muhammad Noor, and now Dostum joining him in Balkh, which are surrounded by the Taliban, and you have Panjshir with the forces of Ahmed Massoud. So they are very diverse, and in Talaqan and also in Badakhshan you have some resistance. But the problem is that I mentioned the problem of centralization of the political and administrative system in Afghanistan, and also the centralization of the ANDSF, Afghan National Security Forces, that Minister Asi was also talking about, and he had the portfolio of leading the defense ministry. Basically, these resistances are there, and the possibility of the Taliban takeover is there, but people will rise. I don't know if they can coordinate, and so we need to wait and see. But if there was an extremist government in Kabul, it will be a huge moral boost for all these extremist organizations. We have extremist organizations in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, as you mentioned, in China, we have in Kyrgyzstan, we have in Pakistan, everywhere. So this will become a moral boost for all of them, and they will also start. I mean, they have links. They have already a lot of links with the Taliban, and they are. I mean, reports have shown in the past 10 years that about 21 terrorist groups exist in Afghanistan under the umbrella of the Taliban. So these are all basically linked to the region, and this will they will basically get a lifeline through the Taliban if this was the case. So, as it was warned by the panelists, such a situation it will not only harm people of Afghanistan, but also the region, and even it can be a global danger. We saw before his assassination, Ahmad Shah Massoud came to Europe, and he addressed the European Union Parliament, where he gave a stark warning to the world that soon the problems of extremism that they are facing in the early 2000s and 1990s in Afghanistan will haunt the world, not only Europe, but also United States of America. After his assassination, we saw that, and I think this situation is even more dangerous than the 1990s and early 2000s. So this is my view, honest view, actually, and that's very unfortunate.
Thank you. And final question is for Tanya. I just match my missions in Afghanistan. In the first one, the biggest threat was not only Taliban, but organized networks, organized criminal networks. We were receiving reports on kidnapped children, for instance, drug trafficking mainly, and also local networks connected with each other, kidnapping people and selling it to Taliban for much more money. And today, if in terms of collateral impact, if there happens a type of escalation on the ground, I think these organized crime networks will pop up significantly and will challenge the daily routines of Afghans. That's fact. And poppy cultivation and trafficking is one significant input to finance all these criminal networks. So how do you see the trend of poppy cultivation after a probable Taliban government and its impact to local dynamics, because it's, for me, I think this is one of the most dangerous issues for the daily routines of the Afghans.
I think it's premature to discuss a probable Taliban government because the war hasn't been fought and lost, although you wouldn't know it reading some of the headlines in Western media these days. But no, I don't think it's a probable outcome. That said, I do want to make a few points based on what the other panelists said. It's become something of a mantra to say we cannot solve Afghanistan's problems militarily. Absolutely, we cannot solve the problems when most of the armed insurgency groups, not just the Taliban, but the others as well, have their bases in Pakistan. So, I mean, I think that is an issue better discussed by Tamim and Zalmay, but that is it's not a secret. So that complicates the military approach to the conflict. But I would also like to make a reference to a report by the UN last June, where I forgot the name, the title of the report, but they said that rather than weaken their links with Al-Qaeda and other terror groups, that the Taliban had in fact strengthened those ties, and that there was serious concern by the United Nations that even though the talks were underway in Doha, on the premise that the Taliban would sever links and would help the Americans prevent Afghanistan from becoming a platform for terror attacks, that quite the opposite was taking place, even as those talks were underway. So those are the points I would like to raise.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I would like to thank you all. The problem is huge, and addressing such a problem is a matter of, playing a chess with nobody but by yourself. So let's see what will happen. But I think we should rely on, first, legitimacy. Second, as international community, we should be committed and determined for a commonly shared stance to address the problems in Afghanistan. If any of the actors in international community plays in a different manner, that means it will have an impact on the ground in Afghanistan. So I would like to thank you all. I hope that we just contributed to the minds, because I saw many people following us. By that way, maybe we can promote peace and stability with a clear consciousness. Thank you so much.